The silver caught the lamplight like a dying star. George's weathered hands trembled as the locket fell, striking the wooden floor with the sound of breaking hearts. 12 years of carefully buried hope erupted in a single, impossible moment. The child's innocent words, "That's my mama's name," had torn open wounds he thought had scarred over forever. In the suffocating silence of his Oklahoma cabin, the past reached through time itself, demanding to be acknowledged. The locket lay between them, like a bridge across an ocean of grief, its engraved letters spelling out a name he whispered only in his darkest dreams. The autumn wind rattled the cabin windows as George stared at the small girl sitting across from his kitchen table. Lily's dress was torn at the hem, her dark hair tangled from days of traveling alone across the unforgiving Oklahoma plains. She clutched a piece of cornbread in one hand, while the other rested protectively over something hidden beneath her collar. The lamplight cast dancing shadows across her young face, highlighting the exhaustion that no 12-year-old should carry. George had found her 3 hours ago, collapsed near his water well, mumbling about angels and Mama's voice calling her home. The silence between them stretched like the endless prairie outside, broken only by the crackling of wood in the fireplace. George's calloused fingers drummed against the table's edge as he studied the child's features, searching for clues about where she belonged. Her eyes held a depth that reminded him of someone he'd spent 12 years trying to forget, someone whose memory lived in every corner of this lonely cabin. The way Lily tilted her head when she listened, the delicate curve of her smile when she thanked him for the food, everything about her stirred echoes of a voice that once filled these rooms with laughter. "Where did you say you came from, child?" George asked, his voice rougher than he intended. The question hung in the air like smoke from his pipe, heavy with unspoken concern. Lily's fingers moved instinctively to her throat, touching whatever lay hidden beneath the fabric of her dress. Her eyes darted toward the window, as if expecting someone to emerge from the darkness beyond. The fear in her expression was raw and immediate, the kind that comes from witnessing things no child should see. "The mission," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind's mournful song. "Sister Margaret said Mama left something for me there before she went to heaven. Said I had to find the man with kind eyes who lived where the sun sets behind the mountains." Her small hand trembled as she spoke, and George felt something twist painfully in his chest. The description was too specific, too familiar, like words spoken by someone who knew this place, who knew him. The mission was 200 miles east, a journey that would have taken her weeks on foot. George leaned forward, his weathered face softening with concern. "What did your mama leave for you, Lily?" The question escaped before he could stop it, driven by an inexplicable need to understand why this child had appeared at his doorstep, like an answer to prayers he'd stopped praying. Lily's eyes met his, and in that moment he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a look of recognition, as if she'd been searching for him her entire life. Her fingers worked at the collar of her dress, revealing a thin silver chain that caught the lamplight like captured starfire. The locket emerged slowly, as if reluctant to reveal its secrets. It was small and delicate, the kind of jewelry a woman might wear close to her heart, engraved with intricate patterns that spoke of careful craftsmanship and deep love. George's world tilted on its axis as memories crashed over him like a flash flood in the desert. He knew that Locket had held it in his hands on their wedding day, had watched it rise and fall with her breathing during countless peaceful mornings. The impossible truth began to dawn on him, terrible and beautiful in its implications, as Lily's innocent voice prepared to shatter the carefully constructed walls around his heart. "That's my mama's name," Lily said, her voice filled with the simple pride of a child sharing her most precious treasure. She held the locket toward the lamplight, and George saw the engraved letters clearly for the first time. Margaret Rose. The name hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and sending shockwaves through every nerve in his body. His hands began to shake uncontrollably as 12 years of carefully suppressed grief erupted in a single devastating moment. The locket slipped from Lily's small fingers, and George watched in horror as it fell toward the wooden floor, each second stretching into eternity. The metallic clang echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, followed by a silence so profound it seemed to swallow sound itself. George stared at the locket lying between them, its silver surface reflecting the firelight like tears on a gravestone. Margaret Rose, his Margaret Rose, the woman who had vanished without a trace during a supply run to town 12 years ago. The woman whose disappearance had hollowed out his soul and left him a ghost haunting his own life. The impossibility of the moment crashed over him in waves, each one more devastating than the last. Lily's eyes widened with alarm as she watched the color drain from George's face. "Mister, are you sick?" she asked, her voice trembling with sudden fear. She slipped from her chair and moved toward the fallen locket, but George's sharp intake of breath stopped her mid-step. His eyes were fixed on the small piece of jewelry, as if it were a rattlesnake coiled to strike. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and impossible truths. George's mind raced through memories he'd buried so deep he thought they'd never surface again. Margaret's laugh, her gentle hands, the way she hummed while cooking breakfast. "Where?" George's voice cracked like dry leather. He cleared his throat and tried again, each word feeling like broken glass. "Where did you get that locket, child?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of 12 years of unanswered prayers and sleepless nights. Lily knelt beside the locket, her small fingers hovering over it, as if afraid to touch something so obviously precious. Her eyes darted between George's stricken face and the silver pendant, confusion and worry warring in her young features. "Sister Margaret gave it to me before she died," Lily said, her voice growing smaller with each word. "She said it belonged to my mama, and that someday I'd find the man who gave it to her. She said he'd have sad eyes and gentle hands, and he'd know Mama's real name." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread through George's consciousness and shattered everything he thought he knew about loss and hope. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white, anchoring himself against the tide of emotion threatening to sweep him away. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls as George struggled to process the impossible truth before him. This child, this beautiful, innocent child, was somehow connected to Margaret, to the woman whose absence had defined his existence for over a decade. The locket lay between them like a bridge across time, its engraved surface holding secrets that could either heal his broken heart or destroy what little peace he'd managed to find. As Lily reached for the pendant with trembling fingers, George realized that his carefully ordered world was about to change forever, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The locket lay between them like a wounded bird, its golden surface catching the dying light that filtered through the cabin's dusty windows. George's hands trembled as he stared at the delicate engravings, each curve and flourish a knife twist in his chest. The name Elena seemed to pulse with life, mocking him with memories he'd tried so desperately to bury. Lily watched him with those impossibly knowing eyes, her small frame rigid with anticipation, as if she understood that this moment would reshape everything they thought they knew about their lives. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap under the weight of unspoken truths. George felt his carefully constructed walls crumbling, brick by brick, as the past reached out with ghostly fingers to reclaim him. The cabin seemed to shrink around them, its familiar corners suddenly foreign and threatening. George's breathing grew shallow as he fought against the tide of memories that threatened to drown him. Elena's laugh echoing through these same walls, her gentle hands tending to his wounds after long days on the range. The way she'd hum while preparing supper as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. He'd convinced himself that those days were nothing more than fever dreams, phantoms conjured by a mind too broken to accept reality. But here was proof, tangible and undeniable, that Elena had existed, had loved, had left behind more than just the hollow ache in his chest. The locket seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, as if it contained not just a name, but the weight of an entire life unlived. Lily's voice cut through the suffocating silence like a blade through silk. She was beautiful, wasn't she? The words were barely a whisper, but they carried the force of a thunderclap in the stillness of the cabin. George's eyes snapped to hers, searching for some explanation, some rational reason why this child would speak of Elena as if she'd known her. The girl's face held a serenity that seemed impossible for someone so young, as if she carried secrets that belonged to another lifetime. Her small fingers reached out tentatively toward the locket, and George found himself unable to move, paralyzed by the terrible certainty that whatever came next would shatter the last remnants of his sanity. The air between them crackled with unspoken questions, each one more impossible than the last. "How do you know about her?" George's voice emerged as a broken rasp, the words scraping against his throat like sandpaper. He watched as Lily's expression shifted, a shadow of something ancient and sorrowful passing across her young features. The child seemed to age before his eyes, her innocence replaced by a wisdom that had no business residing in someone barely past childhood. She lifted the locket with reverent care, cradling it in her palms as if it were made of spun glass and starlight. The metal caught the lamplight and threw dancing shadows across the cabin walls, creating patterns that seemed to tell stories of their own. George felt his world tilting on its axis, reality bending and warping around this impossible moment that defied every law of nature and reason he'd ever believed in. "She comes to me in dreams," Lily said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "She tells me stories about this place, about the man who loved her more than life itself, about the baby she never got to hold." The words hit George like physical blows, each syllable driving deeper into wounds he'd thought had finally healed. His vision blurred as tears he'd held back for years finally broke free, carving hot tracks down his weathered cheeks. The cabin spun around him, memories and present reality bleeding together until he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Elena's face materialized in the shadows, her dark eyes filled with the same gentle sadness he saw reflected in Lily's gaze. The impossible was becoming possible, and George felt his grip on sanity slipping like sand through desperate fingers. The locket seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat as Lily placed it gently in George's trembling hands. "She wants you to know that she never stopped loving you," the child whispered, her words carrying the finality of a benediction. George collapsed to his knees, the weight of 15 years of grief and guilt finally breaking him completely, as the ghost of his beloved Elena seemed to fill the cabin with her presence, offering forgiveness he'd never dared to hope for. The storm that had been building all day finally broke as darkness claimed the Oklahoma sky, rain hammering against the cabin's tin roof like the desperate fingers of the dead seeking entry. George knelt on the rough wooden floor, the locket clutched against his chest as sobs racked his body with the violence of a man finally allowing himself to feel 15 years of suppressed anguish. Lily stood beside him like a small sentinel, her hand resting gently on his shoulder with a touch that seemed to carry more comfort than any words could provide. The lamplight flickered and danced, casting their shadows large and strange against the cabin walls, creating the illusion that they were not alone in this sacred space of grief and revelation. Through the rain-streaked windows, lightning illuminated the endless prairie in stark, momentary clarity, as if the very heavens were bearing witness to this impossible reunion of past and present. "Tell me about the dreams," George whispered, his voice hoarse from crying, his eyes never leaving the locket's golden surface. Lily settled beside him on the floor, her small frame radiating a calmness that seemed to steady the very air around them. She closed her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice took on a quality that was both her own and something infinitely older, as if she were channeling words from across the veil of death itself. "She's always in the garden behind the house that used to stand here, the one that burned down the winter after she died. Her hands are dirty from planting roses, and she's singing that song about the mockingbird that you used to love." George's breath caught in his throat. He'd never told anyone about Elena's garden, about the roses she'd tended with such devotion, about the way her voice would carry across the prairie as she worked in the fading light of evening. The child's words painted pictures so vivid that George could almost smell the rich earth of Elena's garden, could almost hear the rustle of her skirts as she moved between the flower beds. "She talks about the baby room you built together, the one with the yellow walls, because you didn't know if it would be a boy or a girl. She says she watches you sometimes when you sit by the creek where you scattered her ashes, and she wishes she could tell you that it wasn't your fault." Lily's eyes opened, and in them George saw depths of understanding that no 12-year-old should possess, as if she carried within her small body the accumulated wisdom of generations. The rain continued its relentless assault on the cabin, but inside, time seemed suspended, caught between the world of the living and the realm of memory and dreams. George felt as though he were drowning in the impossible beauty of hearing Elena's thoughts spoken aloud by this mysterious child who had appeared in his life like an answer to prayers he'd been too broken to utter. "The fever took her so quickly," George said, the words emerging like confessions torn from his soul. "One day she was laughing, planning the nursery, talking about names for the baby. 3 days later, she was gone, and the child with her. I couldn't save either of them." His voice broke on the last words, and Lily's small hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his calloused ones with surprising strength. The locket seemed to grow warm between them, as if it were responding to their shared grief, their mutual connection to the woman whose name it bore. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, but within the cabin's walls, a different kind of tempest was finally beginning to calm. George felt something shifting inside his chest, a loosening of the iron bands of guilt and self-recrimination that had bound his heart for so many years. "She says the baby is with her," Lily continued, her voice soft but unwavering. "A little girl with your eyes and her smile. They're waiting for you, but not yet. You have work to do here first. She says I'm part of that work, that finding me wasn't an accident." The words hit George like lightning, illuminating corners of his heart that had been dark for so long he'd forgotten they existed. He looked at this strange, wonderful child who had wandered into his life carrying impossible gifts of healing and revelation, and for the first time in 15 years he felt something that might have been hope stirring in the ashes of his despair. The locket caught the lamplight and seemed to wink at him, as if Elena herself was smiling down from whatever realm she now inhabited. The storm outside was beginning to weaken, its fury spent, and George realized that something similar was happening within his own tortured soul. As the night deepened around them, George pulled Lily close, and together they sat in the warm circle of lamplight, the locket resting between them like a bridge spanning the impossible distance between life and death, between past and future, between a broken man and the child who had come to show him that love never truly dies. It simply waits, patient and eternal, for the moment when healing can finally begin. Dawn broke over the Oklahoma prairie with the gentle persistence of hope returning to a wounded heart, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to whisper of new beginnings. George woke to find himself still on the cabin floor, Lily curled against his side like a small, trusting animal, the locket resting in his open palm, where it had remained throughout the long night. The storm had passed, leaving behind air so clean and fresh it seemed to carry the promise of redemption on every breeze that stirred the curtains at the windows. For the first time in 15 years, George felt the weight of mourning without the crushing burden of despair that had greeted him every day since Elena's death. The child beside him stirred, her dark eyes opening to meet his with that same impossible wisdom that had shaken his world to its foundations, and he knew with absolute certainty that his life had been forever changed by this small miracle who had wandered into his existence carrying the key to his salvation. "She's happy," Lily said simply, her voice still thick with sleep, but carrying the clear ring of truth. "She says you're ready now to live again, really live, not just exist like you've been doing all these years." George felt tears prick his eyes, but these were different from the anguished sobs of the night before. These were tears of release, of gratitude, of a man finally allowing himself to believe that forgiveness was possible. He helped Lily to her feet, marveling at how this small person had managed to carry such enormous gifts of healing within her fragile frame. The locket seemed lighter now, no longer a burden of grief, but a treasured reminder of love that transcended death itself. Through the cabin windows, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon. But instead of seeming empty and desolate as it had for so many years, it now appeared full of possibility, pregnant with the potential for new life and unexpected joy. The morning routine that had been mechanical and joyless for so long took on new meaning as George prepared breakfast for two instead of one, his movements infused with purpose he hadn't felt since Elena's death. Lily helped with quiet efficiency, her presence transforming the cabin from a tomb of memories into a home once again. They worked in comfortable silence, but it was the silence of understanding rather than the hollow emptiness that had characterized George's solitary existence for so many years. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, and George found himself actually humming, for the first time since he'd lost everything that mattered to him. The locket sat on the table between them as they ate, no longer a source of pain, but a bridge connecting past and present, loss and hope, the love that was and the love that might yet be. "What happens now?" George asked as they finished their simple meal, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Lily smiled, and in that smile he saw echoes of Elena's gentle radiance, the same warmth that had first captured his heart all those years ago. "Now you teach me about ranching, and I teach you about living," she said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that seemed to be her trademark. "She says there's a lot of work to be done here, and we're going to do it together." George felt his heart expand in his chest, making room for emotions he'd thought were dead and buried forever. The idea of sharing his knowledge, of having someone to care for and protect, filled him with a sense of purpose that had been absent from his life for far too long. The ranch that had become a prison of solitude suddenly transformed into a place of potential, a foundation upon which to build something beautiful and lasting. As they stepped out onto the porch together, the morning sun warming their faces and the endless sky stretching above them like a benediction, George felt Elena's presence one last time, not as a ghost haunting his grief, but as a blessing bestowing her approval on this new chapter of his life. The locket in his pocket seemed to pulse with gentle warmth, a reminder that love never truly dies, but simply changes form, finding new ways to manifest in the world. Lily slipped her small hand into his, and together they walked toward the barn where the horses waited, ready to begin the work of building a life together. The prairie wind carried the scent of rain-washed earth and growing things, and George realized that for the first time in 15 years, he was looking forward to tomorrow. The child who had appeared in his life carrying impossible gifts had given him the greatest treasure of all, the knowledge that healing was possible, that love could triumph over loss, and that sometimes the most profound miracles came disguised as ordinary moments shared between two souls who had found each other across the vast expanse of human loneliness. As they reached the barn and the horses nickered their greeting, George knew that Elena was finally at peace, and more importantly, so was he.